Australia's Parfallow project for the past 5 years or so, and have recently moved over as a threatened species officer with the New South Wales government in the Saving Our Species program for the Southern Eats team, so the Wollongong team of Saving Our Species. I don't intend to let go of all of the fantastic things that I was chasing with BirdLife, and one of those really has been trying to understand tree hollows, trying to look at where they persist in the environment, and really trying to work out why they're so important. So excuse me if there's pictures of Parfallow in here, because that's what I've been chasing in tree hollows. But when we talk about large tree hollows, they apply to so many different types of fauna, as I will talk about as we go through. And I just guess I call them the woody elders because they're really the oldest trees in the forest that we'll see. We really need to champion these large hollow-bearing trees. So I guess for me, we all know that plants are integral to our life on this planet. And one of the lovely quotes that I found about plants that I like to think about a lot is that green plants are fundamental to all other life. If they disappeared, we as humans would also disappear, and so would every other animal. And large trees are a big part of this because, for many plant forms, they're the end of the cycle of growing from tiny to big, and they're the biggest, longest-lived organisms on the planet in some cases. We know that we value trees for a whole heap of reasons as humans. We value them because of their physical aspects, the fact that they absorb heat out of the atmosphere. Of course, that's a huge thing. Whilst climate change is going on, they sequester carbon for us, which is fabulous. They increase the quality of our air by filtering out particulate matters. They reduce noise by baffling with their lovely leaves, and also they provide opportunities for us to do recreational activity. But we also recognise that trees have a really important social value as well. We know that they are proven to improve our mental health. They develop connectedness to nature, which is a really big part of us being on the planet and being happy. And they have a really important aesthetic appeal. Particularly large old trees are the ones that we look at and go, wow, you're a beautiful tree. So I think amongst all of these things, we tend to think about trees in the forest and not so much in the urban spaces, but I like to think about trees everywhere that they occur. And I think it's really important that we do value the importance of large trees in urban spaces as well as in rural spaces, because we realise that threatened species are quite happily using many urban spaces, in some cases very well, as per the Parfallow. And in fact, when we look at the current listing for threatened species in New South Wales, the federal listings, that 25 of the 70 priority threatened species that are with us actually occur in urban spaces. So trees in the urban space are equally as important as those in the rural and forested areas in Australia. And I guess as a biologist, I always look at trees in terms of how important they are for diversity as a whole and what they do. As I said, they store carbon, which is a massive part of their biological importance as well as just their economic importance. They provide essential hollows for animals to nest and den in, of course. They provide the most abundant nectar and seed resources in the forest. So when you look at the figures on this stuff, it seems that every 10 years of life that trees grow and age, they're increasing the amount of nectar and seed that they put back into the ecosystem by about 5 times, which is pretty amazing. And after death, they provide a huge resource for wildlife and for plants as well, both as structures for plants and for wildlife as habitat. So we would estimate that the life of a large hollow-bearing tree, once it develops a hollow, which might take 200 odd years, is another 80 years bearing that hollow. And then beyond that, after that 80 years, when it dies, we would expect that it might persist in the environment for at least another 50 years as a fantastic resource to be used. So these are structures and organisms that are around for a really long time and have a very important role. And that's why we consider them to be keystone structures. So when we talk about what are the things that we look at in the environment that are so important for conserving great diverse habitats, hollow-bearing trees are one of those things. We know that of the 176 species of wildlife that hang around on the east coast of Australia, 17% of all of our birds must use trees, 42% of all of our mammals, and 28% of all of our reptiles. And trees do a lot of things that we don't think about very often. They're actually incredibly important in disease transmission, particularly at the moment. The two diseases that are linked to tree hollows are things like beak and feather, which we know is affecting our parrot populations, and also hopping over into other species like raptors. And particularly frogs use tree hollows quite readily to remove things like chytrid fungus, which is one of the things that's causing decline, particularly in a lot of our wet tropics frogs. So tree hollows allow frogs to get up into the trees in the dry season and actually dry out and shed fungus, so that when they come back down to the water, they're healthy again the following year for breeding. And so those are sorts of things that tree hollows provide to the environment that we really don't know much about. And in fact, for many aspects of tree hollows, it's a great mystery to us, and we're still learning. We're kind of at the beginning of all of this process of understanding hollows. But we do know that losing tree hollows is a key threatening process for all of our Australian wildlife, and that's what I would like to talk about a little bit. Of course, when you see a little face like that poking out of a hollow, it's likely to be one of our friends, the powerful owls. And I guess for powerful owl and for many birds, it's important to recognise that living and dead trees function very differently, particularly because hollow-bearing trees with live bark tend to buffer temperatures, and that will change the way animals use the hollows inside the trees. Fauna will often need multiple tree hollows to go through their life cycle, so it's not just one size fits all for tree hollows, and depending on the weather, different tree hollows will be useful for different fauna at different times of the year. And it's really important to recognise where hollows occur in the landscape. So particularly in the urban space, we find trees tending to occur in those really stark interfaces between the hard surfaces, so the suburbs, and those remnant vegetation strips that exist in the riparian areas. And those are really important places to go and look for tree hollows, and it's often where tree hollows are threatened by a lot of the processes we do, particularly maintaining APZs and expanding suburbs, and also bush regen can be quite harmful for things that go on in the urban interface for trees. Sorry, I just have to move my window. It keeps sitting over the text here. I'll put it in the middle. So the way that tree hollows form is quite varied, but it follows three pretty dependable steps. Where tree hollows actually form in the environment will depend on how wet the environment is. Often riparian areas hold lots of hollow-bearing trees in our old woody elders, primarily because they're areas where timber getting didn't happen when all of that historic timber getting and more recent timber getting was going on. But sometimes it's about the wetness in the environment that encourages the development of hollows. So usually a tree hollow starts to form either in the main trunk of the tree or in one of the side branches as a spout. Often it does start in a spout, and it will start to form because that tree has been damaged. It might be by a wind event, by lightning, by fire. And then once the bark is damaged, a bacterial, fungal and insect attack can happen in that damaged area, and then the tree hollow starts to form. So the timeline for hollow formation varies a lot depending on the species of tree. But for small hollows, we're talking about small, the size of a pygmy possum. We're talking, usually about 80 years, something like a sugar glider hole, about 80 years to start to form. When we get up to a medium-sized hollow, brush-tailed possumy size, we're talking between 150, potentially up to 200 years, depending on the tree species. And then when we want to go to the large hollows that are owls and some of the larger parrots like Glossy Black-cockatoos, it can be upwards of 200 years to actually form a hollow. So I guess one of the important things to notice about this is that I'll talk about how we lose tree hollows in the environment in a minute, but we need to think about the fact that we need to recruit tree hollows back into our forested environment as well. And that means not just retaining trees that actually bear hollows at the moment, but also retaining all of those fantastic large trees that haven't yet developed hollows or are only somewhere along this path, because that process of recruitment for the next generation of tree hollows is hundreds of years away. So it's really important that we think about the future large hollow-bearing trees as well as what's here at the moment. I just wanted to show you what an old hollow-bearing tree looks like. I was running around Bungonia yesterday, and this is the photo of my climber. I'm standing on the ground, so it's a bit blurry, excuse me, but that's a glossy black hollow in a scribbly gum. And I guess in terms of the species that like to produce hollows, it's lots of our gums and boxes that do very well. Things like stringy barks and our ashes tend to be not as good at producing hollows. So there's a list of species there around our area in Sutherland, particularly Sydney red gum, Angophras are great ones at producing hollows. They're a really responsive tree. You just go for a walk and have a look at them flowing over rock and you'll know exactly what I mean there. They a very pliant or fluid species of tree, and they develop hollows very easily, which is great for powerful owl, of course. And then when we think about the difference between native species and non-native species, things like willows and pines and conifers tend not to develop hollows particularly easily. Although those of you that know much about the Royal Botanic Gardens, you'll know that there was a poplar there that was quite happily homing a family of powerful owl, which has actually fallen away a large part of the hollow this season. So we'll see how we go for breeding. But generally we find that those softwoods are not very good at producing hollows, particularly that many wildlife can use. And because they're evergreen, it's not just about the development of chemicals in the leaves, but also in the heartwood of the tree that can be quite acerbic for wildlife. So often that's another reason that they don't tend to like those sorts of timbers. Oh, I thought I'd just show you the inside of that cockatoo because it's the first one that I've actually seen, so it's super exciting for me. And that we're looking about 90 centimetres down into the hollow, and there you can see some cockatoo eggs in the bottom. And I thought I'd just give you a little run through of what a tree hollow looks like inside, because it's not something that we really see. And as I said, this tends to be the secret stuff that happens inside hollows. They look remarkably similar, even though we're looking at different species of tree here. So on the left, we have Angophra. That's a Sydney peppermint in the middle. And this is actually also another Angophra from down in Southo. So generally, when you look in a hollow, even if wildlife has been using it relatively recently, you just see this friable material that we call mudguts inside the tree. It's actually rare. In this central picture, you can see a few feathers that are left over from some tucker that was eaten in the tree, but it's quite rare to find that. Even when you've got animals that have only recently vacated, it's very common that you'll just see this friable sort of dry material. And that mudguts, I think, is an untapped resource. We just don't understand what goes on there, but I think that's really the key to why tree hollows work the way they do. I think there's a really incredibly dynamic recycling environment that exists inside hollows that we don't see when we try to replicate a hollow with something artificial. And I guess one of the great bits of research that David Lindemeyer has been, he's been looking at tree hollows for quite a few years now, but one of the things that I really loved that he said was that a critical step in large old tree hollow management is to stop felling them where they persist and to begin restoring populations where they've already been depleted. And that's really the whole key to understanding tree hollows and thinking about how we should conserve them. Thinking about the rates of loss of hollows, we know that we target for selective removal hollow-bearing trees and old trees in urban spaces and in rural spaces as well. I'm sure many of you have been shocked by the street tree clearing that's been going on for the last 5 years or so. Certainly, if I'd gone down my road and taken a picture, there was 5 stumps of beautiful old trees that used to be there a few years ago, and we're all experiencing that level of clearing in our current environment in the urban and peri-urban areas. But trees are also removed in rural areas because often they're considered to be dangerous, and because of that we go and take them out specifically. And one of the things that happens particularly in areas that are more fire prone is that fire will attack large hollow-bearing trees. So this tree that you're looking at on the picture there is actually one of the owl nest trees from Alfred's Point. Lloyd Hedges took a photo for us. I'm sure you all know Lloyd. And that was actually a nesting tree that had been used for years and years by that pair of owls. And after the Alfred's Point fires went through, those pair of owls actually sat next to the tree hollow, and they do a really obvious grieving noise when they've lost a baby, and they did the same thing for this tree hollow. It was actually quite dramatic. So the reason, and I would say that this Alfred's Point tree didn't actually catch fire. It burnt from the inside out, and that's something that large trees, it's one of the reasons that they're selectively removed by fire, because fire can, we know that ember attack was a huge thing for many of the houses that were facing bushfire in black summer fires, and ember attack happens for large tree hollows as well, particularly because at the hollow entrance there's this vortex of air that moves around, and that tends to draw embers inside the tree. So often you'll find that they're burning from the inside out when they haven't even been touched by fire on the outside, which is what happened in this case at Alfred's Point. So in terms of numbers, we would expect that trees occur in forested environments at about 7 to 27 individuals per hectare. And in urban environments, that will change depending on historical use of the area, but usually we would estimate that we lose 1 tree every 3 hectares for cool burn, and more than that, probably double that for hot burn or more. And I guess one of the things that we know, particularly about the urban space, although we don't have data for the forested space, is that if we don't start developing a targeted policy for large tree hollow protection, that we will lose all of our hollow-bearing trees within the next 100 years. The estimate is actually about 98 years before we lose those big, large hollows, 50 centimetres or more. So they're really on their way out, and we need to start doing better to conserve them. One of the ways that we can do that is to a lot of the change, the shift in management in the urban spaces particularly, is to start balancing canopy. So instead of just lopping down a tree that's terribly dangerous and it's going to come and kill us whole, they start managing canopy by removing the crown if it's a stag, and sometimes leaving the stag for habitat, and also by balancing the canopy by lopping off branches so that the trees are not dangerous and don't tip. And that movement towards retaining trees is definitely happening in the urban space, but not quick enough for us to conserve this resource. If we don't do something that's really more targeted, we're going to be in a dire situation in the next 50 years or so. And of course, what happens when tree hollows start becoming rare? Well, of course, everyone likes to fight about them. They either fight about them or share them. I guess that's the thing that happens with tree hollows. In this picture, we're looking at the same tree hollow with a powerful owl chick in the top hole, and the kookaburras are actually nesting in the same hollow down in this bottom section. But sometimes those interactions are not as friendly. And in the left-hand image here, you can see the cockatoo shouting at an owl chick. So this is a really incredibly rapidly developing scenario that we've seen in the last few years for the large hollow users, is that cockatoos have been the bullies in this story and have been pushing the other species out of the tree hollows. And of course, the other thing that happens is, if you look at this picture on the right, you can see a yellow arrow up here. This is where the owls were nesting. And if you can see, that's all that's left, joining the top and the bottom part of that tree together. So animals get pushed into scenarios that they wouldn't actually use simply because there are not enough tree hollows left to do anything, and they have to take what's there. And of course, those sorts of nesting situations tend to be quite precarious. And there are also direct implications of this, a really strong antagonism and competition with these hollows. So this is a little owl chick from Mundina from last year's breeding. You can see this magpie's flying in for a big attack on the little one, and that chick actually died following that attack. Similarly, one of the Hunts Creek chicks was attacked by currawongs, and you can see the broken wing up here, which wasn't actually able to be mended. So this shift from just the birds shouting at the other birds who want to get in there and use the hollow to direct aggression that's resulting in death is something that we're seeing far and far more commonly as time goes on. So I guess, what can we do about it? So these are some of the things that we'd like to do to understand tree hollows and to try to provide an environment that replicates tree hollows. Cut-in hollows are a relatively new wave in the development of what can you do to replace a hollow, and these are holes that you chainsaw into either a living or a dead tree. You can see the arborist peering through the front hole there, and there's a big cut-in faceplate that sits on the back of the tree. So they make a big hole and put the back of the tree back on, and voila, there's a hollow. Unfortunately, cut-in hollows don't really function the same way that natural tree hollows do, and I think a part of the reason that they don't do that is that they lack all of that lovely microclimate that we saw inside the natural hollows. It just doesn't happen, and it might be that these will act like large tree hollows, but we won't know until that microclimate develops, and that might take another 20 years, so it's a bit of a waiting game for cut-in hollows. For some species, definitely for the large hollow users, they haven't been particularly successful so far. One of the other things that we're trying to do is to replicate tree hollows by 3D mapping the internal structure of hollows and then printing them with 3D printers. So the University of Melbourne's pioneering this work through a gentleman named Dan Parker. These, you've probably seen these 3D printed nest boxes before. This is supposed to be a powerful owl nest, but it hasn't been successful. But this one's made out of hempcrete, and so Dan's actually trialling a whole heap of different materials to see if he can replicate something that does behave like a tree hollow. So far, no luck. And of course, the other thing that we try to do when we're thinking about what to do about tree hollows that are vanishing is stick nest boxes up everywhere. I've been working with these lovely couple, Sue and John Trathen from the Northern Beaches, to put up nest boxes all over golf courses to see how well the birds use them and how the nest boxes actually function. And I'll show you what that looks like as we go forward. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is understanding why nest boxes don't work, because they don't work for large forest owl and they don't work for a whole heap of species, although some species really do love them. But a part of that, I believe, is likely to be because they don't behave the same way that natural tree hollows do. So I've been running around climbing trees with my tree climber mates and putting data loggers inside the trees to actually measure thermal microclimates to see how they differ. I would love to have given you the data from this lovely old woody elder type tree, which is a fantastic tree for birds, but sadly they're impossible to climb because they're just too dangerous and they'll fall over if we try to get up them. So we're pioneering some work with drones to see whether we can include our data loggers into the woody elders. I've only been able to include a few of those in my sampling, which has been a bit sad. This is what the data loggers look like inside the hollows. This is actually that tree hollow from Albert's Point before it burnt down a few years ago. And a little brief summary of some of the data, just comparing the old and the young trees in that analysis. So the old dead hollow tree is this paler brown line up the top, and then a tree with bark is the brown line down the bottom. The dotted lines are actually data loggers that sit outside the hollow to compare what's happening inside with what's happening outside the tree. So if we look at a large hollow-bearing tree that's alive, so a good one for animals to nest in, you can see that the temperatures are actually, the humidity is actually quite buffered. Outside the tree, it goes up and down. So you can see that there's the same profile across the two different types of trees. But here we sit at about 85% humidity for a lovely hollow-bearing tree with bark, whereas when we get to an old woody elder that's just has lost its bark and has died completely, that you tend to have a far more humid environment, so water tends to be getting in because the bark's very coruscated. And if you look at temperature, both the old woody elder tree and the large hollow-bearing tree do the same profile, so they go up and down the same way, but they're sitting about 3 degrees apart, which isn't too much necessarily, depending on the type of animal you are. And I guess that suggests that a lot about the way an animal behaves will influence whether or not it can use different types of old and younger hollow-bearing trees. When we compare those trees, which are down here in brown again, to the nest boxes, which are here in yellow, we find a completely different story. So nest boxes, really, trees, whether they're alive or dead, hollow-bearing trees behave quite similarly if you look at these profiles together. But when you start putting nest boxes into the picture, they tend to be a lot hotter than, even though the nest boxes we built were actually air baffled, they tend to be a lot hotter than trees, whether they're alive or dead, when they bear hollows. And that heat goes on for lots of time during the day, which when you're a female mum bird sitting on an egg is a big deal. And particularly when you're a powerful owl, which is a bird species that's really prone to heat exhaustion. And so I guess the ways forward in all of this story are these. It's really clear that our old large trees play a role that's irreplaceable in maintaining diversity for both our threatened species and for our common species. We really need to look more closely at behaviour to understand how the loss of those hollows will impact our wildlife, and that means looking at these tree hollows over time, particularly as the climate changes, because it's likely that the sorts of trees that will be important for wildlife will also change as the climate changes. It's really important that we have to provide education more broadly to the public about the importance of tree hollows And there really is a role for championing these trees, and we need to develop good legislation to protect hollows and those trees that are recruiting into the hollow-bearing population. And we need to embed that into our legislation at all levels. Otherwise, we're going to lose trees as time goes on. And I must really acknowledge all of the great work from my citizen scientists associated with the Powerful Hour project, because they're the ones that hoof about in the forest with me and help us find all these trees. So that work is really important, and it's one of the reasons that I could talk to you tonight. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and view other great content? New videos being added all the time.